Thing I wanted to.
Is a broad spectrum of lesions that we've seen in this fish from a variety of different contaminated habitats that we believe are due to toxicant exposure. The work I'm going to present is essentially a collaboration between myself and a number of other investigators, both at VIMS and at the Gulf Breeze Laboratory of the Environmental Protection Agency down in Florida. And I feel I have to acknowledge these workers because without them, this interdisciplinary project would not have been possible at all. Okay, for the last several years, for about 3 or 4 years now, we've been working predominantly in my lab on the small estuarine cyprinodontid fish, the mummy chog, for a variety of reasons that I'll get into shortly. This is a small fish. Is it loud enough to switch this thing on? Oh, yeah. North, I got something. Can you hear me now? As I said, this is a relatively small, shallow water fish that's tidal marshes. They get to be about 10 to 12 centimeters in length, and anything over 10 centimeters we call a honker. Those are big ones. So this is a small fish, and they display a real prominent sexual dimorphism. The female is a plain silvery color, whereas the male is olivaceous with these prominent pearly white, light blue spots over the entire body, and this is especially noticeable during the breeding season of this fish. There are a number of attributes of the mummy chog that got us all excited about this fish, and I'd like to say that we initially chose the fish because we came up with these attributes, but it's not really true. We found an epizootic of cancer in this fish from a heavily contaminated environment, and then we, with much thought, came up with all these attributes so that we could sell this fish as a model to the funding agencies. But the bottom line is that there are a number of positive attributes to this particular fish that suggest to us that it may be very useful as an indicator of chemically contaminated environments along the eastern seaboard, and potentially also as a model for laboratory studies of specifically hepatocarcinogenesis. The first attribute is that it's an extremely abundant fish. In fact, it's one of the most abundant shallow water fishes along the east coast. And consequently, it's very easy for us to collect these fish. We don't need large vessels to go trawling anymore. These ships generally cost about $80 to $150 an hour, and they seem to be a real drain on the budget. Here, we've streamlined our operation to the point where we throw a small john boat in the back of a pickup truck with a little 5 or 6 horsepower engine and run down as close as we can get to the site that we want to sample at and throw the boat in the water and go. And in half a day, we have all the fish we need. A very important characteristic of the fish is that it is essentially non-migratory. It has a very restricted summer home range. There's some indication in the literature that the home range during the summer of this fish is on the order of about 30 to 40 meters, so they don't move around a whole hell of a lot. There's some controversy about what happens to them in the winter. If we go out to trap them in the winter, we don't catch them, but we don't know whether they're there and just not feeding, or whether they've moved into deeper waters, or whether they actually buried into the sediments. Depending on who you read, you come up with all 3 possibilities. But for a large portion of the year, they have then a very restricted summer home range. So we think that this fish may, in fact, be reflect the overall quote-unquote health of their immediate surroundings, if you will, and consequently they may be a potentially very effective sentinel organism. As I already mentioned, they have a broad geographic distribution. They're found essentially from Nova Scotia all the way down to Florida. And in northern Florida, they're replaced by a very, very closely related species of funulus called Funulus grandis. And that particular species is abundant all around Florida, up along the northern coast of the Gulf of Mexico, all the way down into Mexico to the Yucatan Peninsula. Number 4, as you'll see, it is responsive to toxicants, including carcinogens. And I put that in there because of the data I'm about to show you. There is, however, a question as to the sensitivity of this fish. If you talk to people in a variety of the regulatory agencies like the EPA and the Fish and Wildlife Service, there's the view, a very common view, that the mummy chog is not a very good candidate for these types of studies because it is not sensitive. And I think what's happened in the past is that hardiness and sensitivity to chemical toxicants and carcinogens have been essentially thought to be synonymous, and my contention is that they probably aren't. We don't really know how sensitive the fish is to toxicants on the whole and carcinogens specifically. And that's going to be a question that's fairly difficult to address, except in a comparative sense. They are extremely hardy in that they're a fish that lives in a high-energy estuarine environment, and consequently they're able to they have broad tolerances to a variety of environmental variable fluctuations. They easily adapt to drastic changes in temperature and salinity and such. And I think because of that, this dogma is out there that they are not good for these types of studies. We disagree, however. We think that these two things are two very different phenomena. As far as an experimental animal, they're essentially optimal in size, both for multi-organ histopathology. In very few slides, we can essentially look at all of the important organ systems and tissues in this fish. Yet, at the same time, they're large enough to allow enzymological studies as well as immunological studies, both of which are ongoing right now at VIMS as well. And the nice thing is, we don't have a large fish. We can easily bring these into the laboratory. They're very easy to maintain. Laboratory culture and experimental manipulation is a breeze with these animals. During this time of the year, we can bring them into the lab and they'll be spawning for us in the tanks the next day. All of the life stages are hardy, from the embryo all the way through the larvae to the subadults and adults. All are very easily manipulated in the lab. So we think this fish has a number of positive attributes both as a model and a sentinel. Now, when I first got to VIMS, it was recommended to me that I start my studies in the Elizabeth River. Some of you may have heard of this waterway. It's located in the southeastern tidewater, the southeastern portion of Virginia, the tidewater area, in the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth. This river, at least several mile stretch of it is heavily industrialized. There are a number of commercial and large naval shipyards, such as the one you see here, a large number of petrochemical storage and processing facilities, at least 11 or 12 municipal sewage treatment facilities that discharge into this river, a large variety of light and heavy industry, as well as being the home of the North Atlantic Naval Fleet. So there's some huge naval shipyards here. Consequently, the southern, actually the northern portion of the river is probably one of the most heavily contaminated waterways in the Chesapeake Bay system, if not in the United States. High concentrations of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, chlorinated hydrocarbons. Some of them are polar compounds like the nitrogen and sulfur heterocyclic compounds, PCBs, a variety of chlorinated compounds, as well as pesticides, and heavy metals as well. Extremely high concentrations of a variety of different heavy metals are found in the sediments of this river. Historically, there have also been a number of wood treatment facilities that have operated on the shores of the Elizabeth River. This one is operated by Atlantic Wood Industries, and I think back in 1989 was placed on the EPA Superfund list. Yet, as you can see, it has won a Governor's Clean Virginia Award. This is one of my visual oxymorons. I think you'll appreciate that once I start talking about this particular site. This particular facility has been open since about 1927 and has pressure-treated timbers like telephone poles and railroad ties with both creosote and pentachlorophenol, and also combinations of those two formulations. Looking at that particular site from the river, I don't know, I always forget to check whether things are in focus. Looks okay from up here. Looking at it from the river, you can see the facility in the background here, and there are these two shallow tidal creeks that reach up onto the property. There's one on the north side of this road and toll bridge. You see a portion of a toll bridge here that goes over the river, and there's another one just on the opposite side of this river here. This is what it looks like at low tide. You have a nice Spartina marsh. And of course, this is a tidally influenced river. The salinity here generally ranges anywhere from 15 to 20 parts per thousand. And at high tide, you can actually get a small boat up into that creek. And if you take an oar and you dip down and you disturb the creek bed, you actually liberate raw creosote that just floats to the surface and just spreads out around your boat in this beautiful hydrocarbon sheen. The sediments here are severely contaminated with creosote. Okay, so initially that was one of the sites that I selected to actually try to obtain some fish. We didn't even know if fish would exist in this particular environment, so we went out early on when I first got to VIMS and set some minnow traps and some crab pots and some other types of traps to see what we could catch there. And basically the only thing we could catch in large numbers was the mummy chog, Funulus heteroclitus. And we did an initial study where we found extremely high prevalence of liver disease in the fish, and have since gone on to expand our studies to a variety of other variably contaminated sites in the southeastern Virginia region. And what I want to do today is talk to you about our current lesion nomenclature. And you'll see there's a fairly complex disease process that's going on in these fish. For the most part, I want to concentrate on the histopathology and ultrastructural pathology and make some comments on pathogenesis where I have some thoughts or where we know something about the pathogenesis of the lesions. Then briefly present some of our preliminary evidence for this positive association between this liver disease and chemical exposure in these fish. And that's probably all the time I have to basically go through these first three objectives. There are a number of other interesting ongoing studies related to this particular project that are currently in progress at VIMS that I really won't have much time to talk about. And most of those studies deal with using the fish as a sort of a model system to look at specific aspects of hepatocarcinogenesis and that sort of thing. The handout actually is fairly detailed and will follow my talk fairly well, except of course that that there's actually a lot more detailed information on aspects of the sediment chemistry that I won't mention during my talk, because I want to focus mainly on the pathology, you being a group of pathologists. Okay, prior to that, I want to talk a little bit about fish liver, normal fish liver. We haven't really talked about that at all. Dr. Ferguson just gave a fantastic presentation where he presented initially the normal morphology of several organ systems, and then went to the pathology. I think I'll follow his lead on that. I think that works really well. This is essentially a normal fundulous liver. This is from a fish that we collected from our reference site, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Essentially comprised of a single lobe. It's a small organ on the order of about 1 to 2.5 centimeters in length. Generally, texturally, it's quite homogeneous. The color of the organ can vary considerably, though, from this light pale tan that you see here to a deep dark reddish brown. And also we consider that range to be within the normal for this species. See the gallbladder over here. Okay, histologically, There are several things I want to say about the normal fish liver. One is that unlike the mammalian liver, the fish liver is non-lobular. Okay, this is something that hasn't been brought up yet, and you all may be aware of that, or you may not be aware of that, but you won't find portal triads. You'll have difficulty discerning a central vein within the fish liver. It's a non-lobulated organ. Essentially, it's been described as a tubulo-sinusoidal organ. Rather than plates or muralia of hepatocytes, the liver is comprised of anastomosing, branching tubules of hepatocytes, with the bile canalicculus forming the central lumen of that tubule. There's some excellent work done by Dave Hinton in the 1970s describing the morphology of fish liver. And the fish being an incredibly large and diverse group, there may be some variability to that. The tubular nature of the liver in Fundulus is very difficult to appreciate. At low magnification here, you do see what appear to be cords in histologic sections of hepatocytes that are bordered by the hepatic sinusoids. Did I say that the center of the tubule is a hepatic sinusoid? I said it's a bile canaliculus. It is. The bile canaliculus is the central lumen of the hepatic tubule, whereas the hepatic sinusoids are found on the outside periphery of that tubule. I always find myself worried that I switch those two things around and everybody think I'm an idiot. Okay, here's a higher magnification to show you the cords or tubules of hepatic parenchymal cells. And in the normal liver, they're essentially polygonal in shape. They have a prominent, often centrally located nucleus with a central prominent nucleolus. They're spherical for the most part and very homogeneous both in size and shape. Okay, again, the hepatic sinusoid. I also want to reiterate what Renate has said, and also what Dr. Ferguson has said about the potential for the fish liver to store an incredible amount of lipid and glycogen. This is also a normal liver of Fundulus. In this case, one that's storing a large amount of either lipid or glycogen, or probably both. Looking at livers like this ultrastructurally, we generally see both lipid and glycogen, and I'll show you some ultrastructure shortly. But this is within the range of normal. Generally, though, I find that in this species, although there can be variation from fish to fish in the amount of lipid and glycogen that's stored, generally the appearance of the liver is quite homogeneous, as you see here. Okay, this is a histologic section of liver stained with a monoclonal antibody to P-glycoprotein. P-glycoprotein is a membrane-bound drug efflux pump that plays an important role in multi-drug resistance in the treatment of human tumors. We've become interested in this with the mummy chog, and we found, the only reason I show it here is that it highlights the bile canalicular system beautifully in the fish liver. And in fact, somewhere up here, you can, with a little imagination, almost get the idea that this is perhaps a hepatic tubule with a bile canaliculus in the center, comprised of 4 or 5 hepatocytes. Okay, ultrastructurally, there are many similarities in the fish liver and the mammalian liver. There's a portion of a hepatic sinusoid here, the endothelial lining cell, a small process of a perisinusoidal cell over here, several hepatocytes forming a small bile canaliculus over here. Okay, and you can see that in this particular fish, there is some lipid that's being stored, and much of the hepatocyte cytoplasm is filled with glycogen, which by our protocol, pretty much leaches out during processing. You see that most of the organelles in these cells that store a lot of glycogen are kind of restricted to this perinuclear zone. If you look at the border of the hepatocyte at the hepatic sinusoid, there is a clear, prominent space of Dissay. The cell membrane of the hepatocyte is thrown into folds. You may not be able to see that from out there. And just a higher magnification of three portions of hepatocytes, the apical portions of the hepatocyte, where it actually forms a bile canaliculus with a preductular cell, or the initial cellular component of the biliary system of the liver. And I mention that because I'm going to talk about a specific proliferative lesion that I believe is probably a proliferation of these preductular cells, or as they sometimes are called in rodents and other mammals, the oval cell. Okay, this table sort of gives you an outline of our current nomenclature for the lesions that we see in mummy chug from contaminated environments. And we can break these down basically just for convenience into three groups of lesions. There's a suite of lesions that we consider to be indicative of cytotoxic and degenerative changes in the liver, and these include some of the reactive lesions. Hepatic megalocytosis, there are degenerative foci, in other words, foci of hepatocytes that show considerable degeneration. There's one that we're not real sure about at this time, whether indeed it is a lesion or an artifact of fixation, but until we have some more information on it, we are keeping data on it and keeping track of this condition. It's called dark and light cell. And I'll show you examples of most of these things. Ceroid accumulation is a prominent change that we see in the livers. And Renata also showed you a liver with a considerable amount of pigment being stored within hepatocytes and macrophage aggregates. Hyaline change, fatty change. We do consider certain lesions to be true fatty change in this fish. We see single cell necrosis, nonspecific focal necrosis. Macrophage aggregates are greatly elevated in both in number and size in a number of these sites. Cystic parenchymal degeneration, fluid-filled cysts, and inflammation. Another group of lesions indicative of the, whoops, sorry, to get that a little better focused, of the hepatocarcinogenic process. These includes a whole suite of hyperplastic lesions called foci of cellular alteration, and we see at least 7 different phenotypes of altered hepatocellular foci in this fish. Areas of cellular alteration are essentially just very large altered foci. We see lesions that we at this point are terming foci within foci. In other words, we have either an altered hepatocellular focus or perhaps even a liver cell adenoma within which arises a focus of cells that are less well differentiated, more atypical than the rest of the lesion. And I'll show you some of those. Liver cell adenomas are, in our mind, some of the most difficult lesions to diagnose in this fish, and in fact we don't see very many lesions that we diagnose as adenomas. And hepatocellular carcinomas, both early, very small carcinomas and very large, advanced, highly anaplastic lesions. And in fact we've even seen lesions that very closely resemble hepatoblastoma in children and in mice. And in fact, these, without exception, all arise within hepatocellular carcinomas in the mummy chug as well, just as they do in mice and humans. Then there's a suite of extrahepatic proliferative lesions, and I guess a better title for this would be non-hepatocellular proliferative lesions, because for the most part, these are also predominantly seen to arise in the liver. Several that I consider to be of biliary origin. We have seen a considerable number of exocrine pancreatic neoplasms, both acinar cell adenomas and acinar cell carcinomas. And we've got 2 manuscripts that are in press in toxicologic pathology describing the histology and lesion prevalence of those lesions, and also the ultrastructural pathology. And those papers should be coming out sometime this year. Also, there's a large number of vascular neoplasms that we've seen in this fish from contaminated sites, and I'll show you some of those. And occasionally we do come across lymphoid neoplasms, lymphosarcomas, lymphomas, and we've come across several kidney tumors as well. Although what the relationship between the lymphoid tumors and the kidney tumors and contamination is, we don't know, so I won't show you those. I probably won't have time anyway.
You included the vascular neoplasm, including parasite origin? Parasite.
Yes, I'll show you. The vascular tumors are of 2 basic types, one of endothelial cell origin and one that I think is of pericyte origin. I'll show you examples of those. Okay, let me show you just a few shots of the gross pathology of these livers. And all the lesions I'm going to show you, both gross and histologic and ultrastructural, all came from mummy chog that were caught at the Atlantic wood site, that creosote contaminated site. This is, as I said, a liver from one of those fish, and you can see that there are some fairly large nodular lesions as well as small focal changes within the hepatic parenchyma. And in fact, in this fish, we do see altered hepatocellular foci at the gross level. These small lesions turn out histologically to be altered hepatocellular foci. And in some of these fish, these livers look extremely bad. They'll have large nodular, very aggressive, highly vascularized tumorous nodules. There'll be all kinds of other lesions that are associated with these cystic lesions filled with either dark red, brown, or even black fluid. Large cystic lesions filled with green fluid. This isn't the gallbladder. This is a lesion, as well as a whole suite of smaller, more focal type changes. And in some, the livers are greatly enlarged, and this particular fish had a hepatosomatic index of, I believe, 37. It's an index that gives you the relationship between liver weight and total fish body weight. Normally that ranges anywhere from about 1.5 to 2.5 or 3, depending on species. This particular fish had an index of 37. And again, you can see a variety of different lesions, many of them large and cystic and fluid-filled. And just a broad variety of nodular growths. Okay, first what I'd like to do is go over some of the non-neoplastic changes that we at this time consider to be indicative of cytotoxicity, both sublethal and lethal. And in fact, fatty change is first on my list. This is essentially a diffuse cytoplasmic vacuolization. Cytoplasmic vacuoles can be extremely large and as well as extremely tiny. Many cells will have multiple vacuoles within it, and as I said, the distribution of this sort of a change is very diffuse, is not focal. We never see this kind of picture in fish from our uncontaminated reference sites. Although, as I mentioned, there is the potential by the fish to accumulate both a lot of lipid and a lot of glycogen. This kind of a picture we don't see in control fish, in reference fish. there are a number of changes that are reminiscent of hyaline change. In many of these livers, you'll see a lot of intracytoplasmic inclusions that have a sort of a glassy, homogeneous, hypereosinophilic appearance. Okay, and this is also a very common change that we see in livers of these fish across the board. So some single cell necrosis as well. Here's a good example of single cell necrosis. It's very hypereosinophilic bodies with prominent remnants of nuclear chromatin within them. Essentially, we consider these to be dead hepatic parenchymal cells, a beautiful one down here. Focal necrosis and multifocal necrosis. Believe it or not, this is not all that common in fish at the Atlantic wood site, although we do see it. And essentially, the classic signs of necrosis are apparent in fish, just as they are in mammals. You'll see the nuclear pycnosis and karyorrhexis and karyolysis. You see all those changes, and essentially you see the dropping out of those hepatocytes. This is that change that I'm calling dark light cells. Essentially what we have are hepatocytes within the hepatic parenchyma that stain darker than the surrounding hepatocytes. And essentially they are dark and light cells. And this sort of change has been reported both in mammals as well as fish before, in a variety of different tissues, in tumors as well as non-neoplastic tissues, and has been ascribed to a variety of things, including fixation artifact, cell death, alterations in the metabolic activity of these cells. And the bottom line is we really don't know what this condition is. So at this point, we just prefer to keep track of it in our lesion prevalence calculations. Dave Hinton has been able to eliminate this change by perfusion fixation of Medaka fish. So it may well be a fixation artifact. We don't really know. In the mummy chog, we see this predominantly in the spring, in fish caught in the spring, and we don't see it very much at all in the fall. So we don't know at this point. And as I said, this particular change is evident at the ultrastructural level as well, with these incredibly electron-dense hepatocytes sort of interspersed in the more normal-looking hepatic parenchyma. Cystic parenchymal degeneration is also not a very common lesion in the mummy chog, although we do see it, and this is a fairly good example of it. And essentially, we believe that it represents sort of a specific cytotoxicity to hepatic parenchymal cells, and they essentially drop out, leaving you with the perisinusoidal cell scaffolding of the liver, and these empty locular spaces that are filled with a proteinaceous flocculent material, and very often this is associated with a leukocytic infiltration. Hepatic megalocytosis, and again, this is a non-focal change. In the livers where we see this, it is generally a change that's scattered throughout the liver, where you occasionally here or there you see some of these greatly enlarged hepatocytes with incredibly pleomorphic, bizarre nuclei. Many of them often have multiple nucleoli. Okay, we consider this to be a degenerative change as well. Macrophage aggregates are greatly elevated in number and size in many of these fish. And macrophage aggregates is just another term for melanomacrophage center that Dr. Ferguson talked considerably about. Essentially, these are aggregations of macrophages that are replete with pigments. In the case of the mummy chog, these pigments are predominantly lipogenic. Okay, they're seroid lipofucsin type pigments. They're acid fast. They're Sudan black B positive. They're PAS positive. they're pearls negative. There's no iron here in this particular species. So we consider this material to be predominantly lipogenic pigments, steroid lipofuscin. But they are greatly elevated both in numbers and size. Okay, next I want to talk about some of those lesions that we consider to be associated with the hepatocarcinogenic process. Obviously, this entire spectrum of changes, including these degenerative and cytotoxic lesions, are probably associated and may be very important in the hepatic carcinogenic process. But I separate them just for convenience. Anyway, as I said, there are a number of altered hepatocellular foci that we see in these fish. This is one of the types of eosinophilic foci that are, in fact, the most common altered focus in the mummy chog. You see the border here with the unaffected adjacent hepatic parenchyma, and the border is somewhat indistinct. Okay, the cellular architecture within the focus pretty much is that of the normal hepatocellular architecture. Nuclear pleomorphism is minimal, if there at all. There may be a slight enlargement of the nuclei in these foci. But you'll see that there's a significant reduction in the amount of storage material, either lipid or glycogen, whatever this material is. Significant reduction within cells comprising that focus. This is a second type of eosinophilic focus. You see the border of the lesion here. This is one, we just, at this point, giving it a descriptive term, this is our eosinophilic focus type 2. The first one was type 1. This is one that's characterized by greatly hypertrophied hepatocytes. Actually quite a rare lesion. This is an amphiphilic focus, and these foci are, on the whole, very difficult to see at low magnification because the tinctorial features of the constituent cells are essentially identical to those of the surrounding unaffected parenchyma. Hence, we call it an amphiphilic focus. And consequently, these are very easy to miss, if you're scanning a slide at low magnification. And only at high magnification do you see that there are some significant differences in cellular morphology and nuclear morphology between the cells in the focus and those outside of it. I might add, you see quite a bit of hyaline-like material out here in the hepatic parenchyma, as well as this pale tan pigment. All this material is ceroid lipofuscin, stored in large quantities in the hepatocytes, as well as within macrophage aggregates. We look at those as representing residual bodies, because if you look at those livers ultrastructurally, the hepatocytes have these very heterogeneous, extremely electron-dense inclusions that in our opinion are residual bodies, that essentially what remains following part of the normal intracellular digestion process within that cell. Okay, this is a basophilic focus. Okay, the focus here, the unaffected tissue out here. Yeah, fairly nondescript border. The architecture within the focus pretty much resembles the architecture, the normal hepatocellular architecture. A clear cell focus, and I can't tell you what this is. I don't know whether this is the equivalent of the glycogen storing focus in rodents that are exposed to potent carcinogens, or whether it is something else. I don't know, but we do see this type of a phenotype in good numbers. A clear cell focus, okay, and these can vary considerably. They can essentially consist of hepatocytes that are replete with these small vacuoles, empty vacuoles, giving this microvesicular appearance, or they can consist of hepatocytes that store extremely large droplets of lipid, as you see here. Another fairly rare focus, this is one that I, at this point I'm calling a mixed cell focus because it seems to be comprised of both eosinophilic cells, cells that are extremely eosinophilic, as well as cells that are basophilic. And in fact, there are foci that can consist of any constituents of any of the phenotypes that I've described to you. So there are mixed cell foci, as there are in rodents exposed to carcinogens. Okay, there's a good example of a focus within a focus. Okay, you have the non-affected hepatic parenchyma out here. Here's the border of a large eosinophilic focus, perhaps an area of cellular alteration. I don't remember exactly how big this lesion was. And then within that you have arising another focus of cells that are again tinctorially and architecturally different from the focus proper. And this suggests to us, because we see a lot of these, that most of the altered hepatocellular foci that I've shown you have the potential to progress on to form the more aggressive lesions, the adenomas and the carcinomas. This is a fairly common observation in this fish, the focus within a focus. Okay, this is an adenoma. This is a lesion that I diagnosed as an adenoma. It has a more discrete border. The border is suggestive of being suggestive of expansive growth, although we rarely see compression. It's very rare that we see compression in this fish. But you can see that the tubules within the adenoma are probably somewhat increased in the number of cells that are comprising them. This is one of the primary characteristics that I use to distinguish an adenoma from an altered focus or an area of cellular alteration. In other words, the proliferation of hepatocytes within a tubule and the expansion of that tubule and the thickening of the tubule. Okay, and let me go through a couple of carcinomas. As I said, we're currently breaking them down into early and advanced carcinomas. And this is an example of a small, early hepatocellular carcinoma. The cellular architecture is fairly haphazard. The cells are enlarged. The nuclei are very euchromatic with a very prominent nucleolus. They're greatly enlarged compared to the nuclei of the non-neoplastic adjacent cells. And in fact, these lesions can be quite large. I've seen fish where approximately 90% of the liver has been replaced by hepatocellular carcinoma. There just essentially isn't much of normal liver tissue present at all anymore. They can be also expansive and locally compressive, or, as you can see, the cellular architecture is greatly altered. You can't recognize the normal tubular architecture of the liver at all anymore. Cells are greatly enlarged. Again, that very characteristic euchromatic nucleus with that prominent nucleolus, and just the overall haphazard arrangement of the cells. And in many cases, they show some evidence of local invasiveness, having a very ragged, sharp border. It's a higher magnification. I want to show you just a couple of the different cellular patterns that we see in hepatocellular carcinomas. This is a fairly common pattern that I call trabecular, solid trabecular pattern in the hepatocellular carcinoma. This is a fairly well differentiated lesion. To me, it's still recognizable that this is liver. There are some lesions that are more anaplastic, however, that contain tumor giant cells, multinucleated tumor giant cells, and very atypical mitotic figures. You can see this almost a tripolar mitotic figure. There's another mitosis over here. This is a less well-differentiated lesion. And then some of them are extremely anaplastic, again showing the bizarre tumor giant cells and the incredible both cellular and nuclear pleomorphism and atypia. And in fact, we've seen a couple of lesions that, as I said, resemble hepatoblastoma. And as I said, these do arise within these very poorly differentiated, highly anaplastic hepatocellular carcinomas. At low magnification, they're hyperbasophilic. They have an incredibly high mitotic index. All these dark bodies are mitotic figures here. Very high nuclear to cytoplasmic ratio. The constituent cells look very primitive to me. And I've shown this around to a number of both rodent pathologists and other fish pathologists, and have pretty much gotten an agreement on the diagnosis of these lesions. In fact, some of them show this beautiful rosetting. You can see here, and essentially get these cords or tubules of small, very primitive, very undifferentiated looking cells. And again, very high mitotic index to many of these lesions. This is a P glycoprotein stain of one of those hepatoblastomas. And again, actually in this lesion you get a better appreciation for the tubular nature of the fish liver, and one of the reasons why I show it. Spindle cell proliferation. This is a lesion that I think is probably biliary in origin. I believe that these small proliferating cells forming these tracts are probably biliary and probably represent that preductular cell forming the terminal portion of the bile system.
Fast-growing cells, you think?
Yeah, I haven't been successful in looking at this lesion ultrastructurally, and they may in fact be perisinusoidal or fat-storing cells. And that's something that I think this fall I'm going to try to do to pin this down. The nuclear morphology, though, is highly suggestive of a bile duct element. You can't really appreciate this without actually looking at a glass slide, but the nuclei in these cells are very reminiscent of bile duct epithelium. They're oval. They generally have a very deep cleft, and they're fairly heterochromatic, and they very, very closely resemble bile duct epithelial nuclei. And in fact, sometimes you do find areas where there's some attempts at forming ducts in these tracts. Cholangiofibrosis. The biliary lesions on the whole are very small and quite rare in the mummy chog. The response is predominantly hepatocellular. I think I've now looked at probably close to 2,000 fish histologically, and I've seen perhaps a handful of lesions that I might diagnose as a cholangiocellular carcinoma. They just don't occur very often. Most of the lesions are bile duct proliferation, and very often you'll have a real prominent stroma associated with these very well differentiated ductular profiles, and these lesions I would call these cholangiofibrosis. Very often there's a strong inflammatory component within these lesions as well. Okay, now some of the extra hepatocellular lesions. This is one of the vascular neoplasms, and this is one that I believe to be of endothelial cell origin. It has a fairly ragged, aggressive, locally invasive-looking border, and consists of trabeculae or cords of what appear to me to be endothelial cells, attempting to form small vascular channels that are essentially filled with blood. Here's a higher magnification. You can see these tracts of endothelial-like cells forming these loose, cavernous, spongy spaces filled with blood. Some of them are a little more solid, though, but always the association with blood, always the attempt to form small vascular channels. In some of the very large aggressive ones, the you actually get the formation of these papillary projections into the vascular spaces. And we have some fairly good evidence that these large bloody tumors actually kill fish. And bringing tumor-bearing fish into the lab and holding them for extended periods of times, the fish that die on us invariably have these large vascular neoplasms that ultimately rupture, and essentially the fish bleeds to death. Okay, this to address your question, this is a lesion that I consider to be of pericyte origin, perhaps a hemangiopericytoma. Essentially, you have these swirls, nests of swirling epithelial cells, at the center of which is a small patent lumen that more often than not contains red blood cells. You can see some there, see some here, here, here. That's about it in this section. And a higher magnification, again, to show you this central lumen filled with blood. I'm running out of time. I wanted to talk about the exocrine pancreatic neoplasm. I think maybe I'll forego that and I'll pass over the pancreas material and get straight to some of the episodiology. And you guys can see this stuff when the paper comes out. What a teaser, huh? Okay, as I said, we've looked now at a variety of contaminated sites, both within the Elizabeth River and also within the York River in southeastern Virginia. There are let me see. There are 5 sites within the Elizabeth River, the Atlantic Wood site being located in the southern branch. Okay, that's that creosote contaminated site from which all the lesions I just showed came. Directly across the river is a small tidal creek called Scuffletown Creek, which is considerably less contaminated. That was one of our sites. There are several abandoned wood treatment facilities that we looked at. RFSB is one, and ERW is another. These are abandoned wood treatment facilities that have been inactive for probably going on 20 to 25 years. CTF is a petroleum storage facility on one of these tank farms where they store petroleum products, in this case mostly the lower molecular weight compounds, I think kerosene and gasoline and such. In the eastern branch, we looked at a tidal creek adjacent to one of the very large shipyards. Okay, in the Elizabeth, in the York River, we looked at a settling pond at one of the oil refineries, at the Amoco oil refinery, and we looked at a site that's called Catlett Island, which is essentially our reference site. This is one of NOAA's estuarine research reserve sites, and essentially it's been designated as a pristine site that has been set aside for estuarine research. And there are no local sources of chemical contaminants, and it's one of the most pristine sites probably in the Chesapeake Bay system. So those are our 8 sites that we've looked at. Okay, these graphs then represent lesion prevalence data for those 8 sites. Catlett Island, our reference site. Atlantic Wood, the creosote contaminated site. Scuffletown Creek, about 500, 600 meters from Atlantic Wood, okay, directly across the river. And then these other moderately contaminated environments. Okay, this graph shows lesion prevalences for the altered foci. The type 1 eosinophilic focus is probably the most prominent or the most prevalent focus, with over 80% of the fish at the Atlantic Wood site showing eosinophilic focus type 1. I might add that we looked at 60 fish from each site histologically. Okay, so what's represented here is 8 times 60, or 480 fish, which in my opinion is a fairly good sample size. And you can see that the lesion prevalences do track a pollution gradient, apparently, with highest prevalences at the most heavily contaminated site, and also the greatest diversity of altered focus phenotypes found there, whereas at Catlet Island we found very few toxin-associated lesions. Also, Scuffletown Creek, only 500 meters away, very low prevalences of altered foci. Oops. Hepatic neoplasms and related lesions. Area of cellular alteration, focus in a focus, hepatocellular adenoma, early and advanced hepatocellular carcinoma. And again, Catlet Island, essentially none. Scuffletown Creek, none. Crown Tank Farm, that petroleum storage facility, none. One of the abandoned wood treatment facilities, we did see one adenoma and an early carcinoma here, and that's all we saw. Most of the lesions, again, at Atlantic Wood and some of the more heavily contaminated sites. This sort of summarizes the data. Total altered foci prevalence. In other words, if a fish had any kind of altered focus, it was scored as positive, and total hepatic neoplasms. If it had any sort of neoplasm, adenoma, early or advanced carcinoma, hepatoblastoma was scored positive. Again, Atlantic Wood, over 50% of the fish at Atlantic Wood had full-blown hepatocellular carcinomas. Over 93% had altered foci. It's an incredibly high lesion prevalence. A similar sort of trend with the extrahepatic proliferative lesions. KO2, 3, and 4, these are biliary lesions. Vascular neoplasms in this analysis, I've lumped all under vascular proliferative lesions, and pancreatic acinar cell carcinomas and adenomas here. Those, the extreme pancreatic neoplasms we see only at Atlantic Wood. But vascular tumors, we should see at a number of other sites here. There might be a mistake on this graph. We actually see vascular tumors. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, this is the red one. We see those at 4 sites. And some of our preliminary correlations or attempts to correlate sediment chemistry with lesion prevalence. Again, lesion prevalence in the bars, and total aromatic hydrocarbons in sediments at the various sites. And note that this is a log scale, so we're spanning 6 orders of magnitude in sediment chemistry profiles here, with very low aromatic hydrocarbon concentrations in the sediments at Catlet Island, and extremely high in the percent range. Okay, this is comes out to be about 1.3% of the sediment is polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons at the Atlantic Wood site. But the distribution is very patchy. You have these hot spots, and it really depends on where you're sampling, how high the actual PAH concentrations in the sediments are. But they're extremely high, and then a variety of the moderately contaminated site. We selected benzoate-pyrene just sort of as an example, and again we have a nice tracking of this of the